to have you welcome Dr. Robert Carr.
Okay, I don't know. See if can y'all hear me all right if I just, and I might just put this up here. I guess that'd be all right, wouldn't it? Because I'll kind of move around a little bit, and sometimes carrying that thing around, I forget to have it up to my face. What I'm going to talk about today, this discussion that we're going to have, because if you'd like to have, afterwards some further discussion, I'd be happy to. But what I'm going to talk about today is incidents along the way, 55 years as a pediatrician. And I thank you so much for letting me come to speak to you today, because I enjoyed making up this talk. But 55 years as a practicing pediatrician has given me quite a number of stories. Now, most of those stories will probably be true all the way through. Some will have a little fabrication in them, but otherwise, I think most of them will be of interest to you. Most will be amusing, others not so much amusing, but perhaps will be some insight into the building of a physician. I'd always wanted to be a doctor, and the first job I obtained in the medical field was as a clinic registration clerk at the old West Texas Medical Clinic, just about a block from here. It was the Doctors Dunn and Dr. English and Dr. Hunt who allowed me to stand behind a railing in the small, crowded surgical room at West Texas Hospital and watch some minor surgical procedures as they were being performed. I found it very fascinating because I had already decided a long time ago I wanted to be a doctor. It certainly solidified my ambition, however, to go that route. But not so with a friend of mine, because with a chuckle I remember that he went with me to observe some of this surgery, and the first thing he did on the first occasion was he fainted. And he would decide at that time that it would not be what he'd want to go into as a life profession. In 1947, I was accepted as a student to Southwestern Medical School in Dallas. At that time, it was just a campus, small campus, plot of ground behind the old Parkland Hospital, if you know where that is, and whose buildings were not the brick mammoths of present-day schools, but were old. It was an old one-story wooden Army barrack, several of them, moved from a nearby Army base. It just so happened that the Katy Railroad track passed within about 10 feet of the building, and every time it came by, several times during the day, it would shake the entire area because it's just wooden barracks, and you had to wait until it got by before the lecturer could start talking again. So besides the long, tedious hours of study, I remember there were some events that kind of lightened the load as I was learning. Since the barracks were completely empty at night, I did a lot of studying there to help me from being distracted. Late one night, while studying alone, I became aware of an unusual noise coming down the long wooden hallway to my study room. The dissection lab was down that same passageway, and that very day we had finished studying and removing the lower legs of our cadaver. Each day after our study was complete, we placed the body back inside an oilcloth sheet and lowered it into a vat of formaldehyde until the next day. As my imagination began to play, and hearing the swish, swish noise coming down the hall, the picture came to me of my cadaver without his lower legs, maneuvering down the hall, propelling himself along with his arms, and the oilcloth swishing back and forth, back and forth. After a few minutes of letting the picture build in my mind, the noise continued down the hallway and then stopped in front of the only door out of my study room. I knew I had to get that door open, so with my heart racing and with sweaty hands, I swung open the door, and there was a janitor with a large, moist mop sweeping back and forth across the hallway, cleaning the floor. I don't know who was the most surprised. I don't know who was the most relieved. The second rather amusing episode was also a teaching experience. The subject of this day's lecture was diabetes and how to diagnose it, particularly in the past. As you know, this is associated with high blood sugar and high levels of sugar in the urine. The professor had a beaker of, he said, diabetic urine, and explained to us how diabetes in the past was diagnosed by taking a drop of urine on your finger and tasting it to see the degree of sweetness. So he took the urine, put his finger in there, and lipped his finger like that. And I can assure you that after he told us that each one of us had to do the same, and we were students and obviously had to do what the professor said, I can assure you we did it very reluctantly and only because the professor had made it mandatory. When we all agreed as to the sweetness of the urine, his next words were related to another important aspect of making a correct diagnosis of anything, and that was observation. He pointed out that when he put his finger down into the urine bottle, he then put this finger in and licked his finger. We never forgot that observation was very important in medical diagnosis. We all were very anxious to be full-fledged doctors, yet the second year ended without our ever having seen a live patient. Weather provided us our chance, however. At the end of the second year, a major step was the awarding of each student with his personal stethoscope and a long white coat to wear. On the very day we received ours, the town of McKinney, which was 30 miles away from Dallas, had a tornado that ran through the middle of the town. The medical school was called to ask for emergency care assistance in assessing the damage. The school called my medical fraternity house and requested that any available senior students they would like to send over. There were none, but there were 5 of us sophomores, newly crowned with that medical attire and new stethoscopes, and knowing nothing more than how to apply Band-Aids, we decided to go. With white coats, stethoscopes in our pockets around the neck came later. We raced to the rescue. All traffic had been stopped and moved to the side of the road, but we were treated like the presidential car in Washington, D.C. With our white coats, we were waved right down the center of the highway. It was a proud day for us pseudo-doctors to be going in to save lives. But luckily, our help was not needed, and so we took a slow tour to see the town's damages and then returned to Dallas to become real doctors. Medical school had 9 months classes with no classes in the summer. For extra money, the first summer I worked as a grocery stacker, replenishing empty shelves with groceries. The second as a door-to-door salesman of the Encyclopedia Book of Knowledge, which I quickly decided I'd never want to do that again. And the third as a sleep-deprived nighttime sitter for hospitalized patients. Betty and I married after my freshman year, and our first apartment may bring back similar memories for each of you. While studying for first-year final exams, I hunted and found a second-story, 3-room apartment in an old house on Swiss Avenue, East Dallas, across town from the medical school. It was 1 block from Baylor Hospital and 1 block from a very active fire station. We had sirens all day and all night, and we learned to tune them out to the effect that we had a fire next door and never woke up to the commotion. And oh yes, we had no sink. In our apartment, we got water from the bathroom, which we shared with the couple in the other apartment upstairs. We also had an old-fashioned ice box, and I mean ice box, for our food, and we had to be there every 2 hours to dump the water out, so we never were able to go anyplace. Couldn't afford it anyway, but at least we had to dump the water out. But it was cheap. We had no car. We relied on buses. 3 months later, we found a better apartment on the medical school part of town under the government OPA for $40 a month with a refrigerator and with a kitchen sink. My first active participation in a medical procedure came as a complete surprise. As a junior medical student, I was assigned to Baylor Hospital OB Hospital to observe only, just to go over there as a junior. Well, we were very busy this particular night. The delivery rooms were full and all available doctors and nurses were occupied. The downstairs receptionist requested help because of the arrival of an impending delivery. I was the only person not busy, so I was requested to go down with a wheelchair and bring the patient to the delivery floor. That was all well and good, but the lady was on the verge of delivery, and she was also wedged in the back seat of a small Volkswagen Carr and unable to move. I must admit that I had little to do with the birth, but I assisted the mother as best I could, and the baby became my first medical encounter. It was especially significant to me since it took place in the back seat of a Volkswagen in the hospital parking lot. Mother and baby were fine, but I was rather shook up. We learned to deliver babies at home, many times in especially economically disadvantaged areas. I remember one birth in the depth of winter with only a coal oil lamp for light in a one-room shack fashioned from an old chicken coop, but with the largest TV available at the time standing in the middle of the room with its own individual tin roof shelter built over to protect it from the elements, from the rain coming down through the roof. The family watched TV while we delivered the baby. We continued to learn the latest diagnostic tests, the new techniques, the sounds of the heart, the meaning of symptoms. We were fast becoming doctors. My internship at Colorado General Hospital in Denver, 1 year divided between all the medical and surgical specialists, was highlighted quickly soon after my arrival by my second delivery, with the mother's sixth child due and the mother late again upon arrival at the emergency room. The baby arrived in the elevator between the second and third floor, in spite of my insistence for her to wait until we arrived at the delivery room. 2 got on the elevator and 3 got off. As with most of us in our early working days, economics continued to be a problem as before, but it did show signs of improvement. In medical school, I had received $105 a month from the GI Bill, plus books and school tuition. Betty received at her first job $125 a month, and then she worked for the VA and received government pay at $225 a month. Now, as an intern, I also received another $50 a month from the hospital. That was my monthly salary for the entire year. It was $50 a month. The even more important, though, I found was I received the option of eating 6 times daily at the hospital. That included 2 snacks, which I did every day, 6 times. With my meals at the hospital, we could afford a steak occasionally with my new expectant wife. She continued working as a medical ward secretary in a locked psycho ward in the VA hospital across the street from my hospital. Incidentally, she worked until she almost delivered like the lady in the elevator. When I kept insisting that she should not go early to the hospital and embarrass me by being in false labor. We finally made it, and barely made it to the hospital, she did. Our first son was born 2 hours after our arrival. A doctor's family never gets the best of advice or medical care. After internship, we returned to Dallas to begin 2 years of exclusive pediatric training at Texas Children's Hospital. Our economic situation continued to improve. My salary remained $50 a month for the first year, but on my being selected as chief resident, it skyrocketed to $75 a month for the second. I also was the recipient of a national one-time cash award given by a medical company of $1,000, and we received that in 4 payments, $250 every 3 or 4 months. It was given to 12 pediatric doctors in training in the United States, so it really helped. This enabled Betty to be a stay-at-home mother, but we ate out only when the relatives came to visit and took us out to eat. Both of us could eat free at the hospital cafeteria. Does that remind some of you about what you did when you were starting out? Hours were long, a minimum of 60 hours per week, plus 2 overnight stays in the hospital on call each week. Although at times exhausting, my education opportunities continued to be excellent. I soon faced the polio epidemic of the 1950s, which most of you all remember infantile poliomyelitis. It was the most dreaded and feared disease of the mid-century. In 1950, there were 40,000 cases of polio in the United States, with Texas the hardest hit of all the states. In fact, in Texas, the hardest hit of all the states, the city of San Angelo had the highest concentration of cases in the whole nation. They had 1 case of polio for every 124 people in the city. As chief resident in 1953 and 54, I became responsible for the overall care, as a result of that appointment, for the overall care of all the polio patients admitted to Parkland Hospital, which was a charity hospital for Dallas and the surrounding area. Although work was being done to determine the cause and the contagiousness and the course of polio, little was known to doctors or even certainly to the public. The severity of the disease, polio, varied from a flu-like condition, just feeling bad, aching, and so forth, to weakness and paralysis of the legs and or the arms, and then even to complete paralysis from the neck down, making it impossible for a person to breathe or swallow his own saliva. Tragically, it also involved primarily the most vulnerable, children and teenagers. Schools were closed. Community and even family gatherings were banned. Swimming pools were closed. All summer exercise was suspect as it might decrease one's resistance, yet it seemed to be of no help whatever we did. Anyone, anywhere, could be stricken and die. It was the black plague of our century. Parkland Hospital became the main receiving center for all of North Texas. Nurses and medical personnel were recruited. They all volunteered to work in the polio ward because you did not hire them for that. You asked them, and if they would, they were certainly assigned there. A large gymnasium-sized room was added on the rear of the hospital to receive all the expected cases. Into this space was brought all the available equipment that was available to medicine at the time. Some flown into Dallas by large C-54 Air Corps planes and then assembled by firefighters and police. 50 1,000-pound iron lungs and all available equipment, drugs, bed linens, nutritional supplies, all available supportive infrastructure requirements were massed into this one area. Now, let me paint you a word picture, something that's remained in my mind. In retrospect, I can recall the sounds and the sights and the odors of that area called the polio ward, and they remain as real to me today as they were to me at that time. I can hear the continuous, monotonous, rhythmic sound of the electric motors on each iron lung as the bellows on each machine pulled in and pushed out the life-giving air into the lungs of each helpless child. Added to this was the high-pitched whirring of the suction machines, almost in continuous use, pulling the thick mucus from the lungs of each child. The whish and the whoo of the iron lungs and the high-pitched whine of the smaller machines combined into almost a dark symphony of mechanical noises that in its own way, however, tended to reassure the workers that life was still present and their care was critical. Blending into this background of fear and noise were other sounds. The muted sounds of doctors and nurses in consultation, the rolling movement of IV and feeding equipment and other mobile equipment over the wooden floor, all taking place in a dusky twilight atmosphere. The only light sources were the gooseneck floor lamps at the head of each iron lung, illuminating the face and body of each patient as he lay in that lung. Completely helpless, but the light was necessary for the nurses to be able to monitor and administer the vital care. There were periods, however, when the noise abated, as a child would be lost to death and his iron lung would be shut off. I saw many a doctor and exhausted nurse with tears in their eyes as the body was wheeled down the central aisle, reminiscent of a funeral procession proceeding down the road to the cemetery. But not for long, because that process of saving the living would quickly begin all over again. One of the first signs of polio was a stiff or sore neck. If you got polio, the first thing any doctor would check would be to put your chin down on your chest. If you had polio, you just couldn't do it because there was spasm in the muscles back here. It is now almost laughable that nurses and doctors flex their necks so many times from morning to night that we all, the doctors and nurses, developed stiff and sore necks, reinforcing the fear that we were in the early stages of the disease. But our fears were real, as we did have 2 nurses and 1 doctor that contracted polio and died. In spite of this, those of the medical staff, they were true heroes and never relinquished their duties. You may have wondered why I wanted to give you such a detailed description of this time in my life. I think that in almost every person's life, there is a seminal moment or a crossover experience, an epiphany that changes one's life forever. In my life, it was my involvement in this polio epidemic. On the polio ward, I had daily disappointments, sometimes almost crushing, and I knew that there would be many more in my life, but I could and I did resolve at that time to become as complete a doctor as I was capable of being, to practice the art of medicine and all it encompassed rather than just being a good medical practitioner. This was my moment of epiphany. For the first time, the Hippocratic oath that I had sworn to as I received my medical diploma became very real to me. I will practice my profession with conscience and dignity. The health of my patients will be my first consideration. In 1955, the polio Salk vaccine was introduced. It had to be given as a shot, and cases of polio, however, immediately plummeted. The Center for Disease Control stated that following the introduction of the improved Sabin oral vaccine the next year, that after that and nationwide immunization with this oral sugar cube, There were only 61 cases of polio in the entire country during 1965, contrasting with the 40,000 cases 15 years earlier. The most dread disease of the 20th century had been conquered due to those courageous scientists working with the virus directly in their labs and those heroic nurses and doctors who risked their lives to alleviate the suffering. Another new science was now appearing on the horizon, the beginning of treatment of diseases by chemical and natural compounds called antibiotics. When I was in training, we had only 3 compounds: sulfa, penicillin, and tetracyclines. Sulfa was discovered in the 1930s. A scientist had placed a dye solution on a growth of bacteria in a growth plate, and in some mysterious way he noted it inhibited the growth of those bacteria trying to grow. It took years of extracting the active ingredient, and when it came out it was called sulfa and was used. Penicillin had an even more fascinating history. In 1928, Sir Alexander Fleming, a British researcher, made a mistake. He too was working with growing various bacteria, finding other substances that might affect them. He had just finished inoculating a growth dish with bacteria when he abruptly had to leave the lab. He left the growth dish open on the workbench overnight. During the night, a current of air picked up a mold, probably from the floor, and deposited it on the growth dish. Dr. Fleming, before disposing of the dish, picked it up, examined it, and noted that there was no bacterial growth at all around this mold colony. It indicated that something was killing the bacteria arising in and around the mold. After much study, it was found this was not an unusual mold. In fact, it was very common. The same mold that grows on an old piece of stale bread, or on the north side of the trees in the forest. It was called penicillium. Thus, the new substance was called penicillin. But it took years to purify and extract the active ingredient until the need became critical in World War II. Even then, only minute doses became available. But this miracle substance would check surgical battle wound infections and pneumonias in just 24 to 36 hours. The drug was so valuable and in such short supply that servicemen who were given the antibiotic initially had their urine collected, the penicillin extracted and sterilized from the urine, and then used again for the next dose. But the gates were open, and a worldwide search for soil samples, animals, birds, and insects, revealed many new antibiotics, so many that it became difficult for me to remember the indications, the cross-reactions, and the side effects of so many because there were so many being introduced. On completion of the residency program, I was offered a place in the academic side of medicine, and also with several Dallas practicing pediatricians, but I chose to come back to Lubbock. So the next major medical phase in my life was the opening of my own private practice in 1954 here in Lubbock. I became associated with 2 fine physicians, Dr. J.D. Donaldson Jr. and Dr. Noel Ellis. We were among the first to build a freestanding medical clinic isolated from the hospitals and devoted strictly for children. It's still standing at 2602 Avenue Q, but soon to be destroyed as the new clinic opens behind it. Dr. Donaldson offered me $250 a week for the next 3 months if I would come and work with him, and then I would be on my own. Office calls were then $3 each, penicillin was $2 a shot, and house calls were $10 before midnight. We worked from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, and we worked on Saturday 9 to 1, and then in the afternoon 4 to 5, and on Sunday like hours. Obviously it was in very high cotton, and we certainly didn't have to worry about any more money. One interesting house call was in the middle of the night to the poor section of town, and at that time we did a lot of house calls. But this was particularly one that was interesting because the son of the visiting king of the gypsies had become ill, and they called me from where they were and asked if I would come out. It was a little hard to concentrate because when I got there, all these circus-type wagons were all around the little house. And when I walked in, there was a room full of people in their native gypsy clothes, and they all watched me with very dark eyes looking at me because I was treating the king of the gypsies' heir. So I was greatly relieved when I finally decided it was a sore throat, gave some medicine, and I was able to leave. Medicine was different between the large cities of Dallas and the relatively small town of Lubbock, too. For example, the dress code was different. Even today it is today. All physicians dressed as professionals at all times. We wore ties, white shirts, dress pants, and either a long or short white coat. Nurses all wore white, starched uniforms with nurses' caps indicating the schools from which they graduated. Compare that today to what people wear into the offices. The emergency room at the local hospital was not at all like today either. West Texas Hospital had a side entrance with a buzzer, which summoned the hospital charge nurse to answer the call. If you went up to the door, it was locked, but you had to push on this button. The lady in charge, the nurse in charge, would come down and see what was going on. The emergency room had two rooms, one just a bed so that they could watch you in case that they wanted to a little while before you went home. And the other was a single room with a hospital operating table, an oxygen bottle, and a small amount of equipment to suture up wounds. At night, after evaluating the patient, the charge nurse then would call the doctor on call, and each of us, whether we were pediatricians or what, had a scheduled time to be on call. She would call them, and we would decide then whether they needed to be admitted, whether another doctor needed to be called, or what. There was nobody there all the time. Methodist had a similar rotation with only two small rooms, along with one large room for the main area. There was no doctor in the house. The doctor had to be called each time. Later, a family practitioner was hired to spend 5 nights a week in the house, and he could handle all calls himself or refer to the appropriate person. And you compare that today to what we have. If the patient was admitted from the emergency room, the cost at that time was $25 to $35 per day. In the 1970s, it still was only $81 a day at the average U.S. hospital. Pediatricians were not plentiful at that time. And when I came here, there was only 6 pediatricians in Lubbock. There was 18 in Fort Worth, 16 in San Antonio, and 3 in El Paso. Some others were throughout the state, but they were mostly in the big towns. This necessitated independent doctors to band together to cover for the ill or on vacation and so forth. But to keep the relationship cordial, the unwritten law was that the treated patient always referred back to the original doctor when the doctor got back into town. Consultation calls were made frequently to surrounding towns at $1 a mile. If I made a call, say to Littlefield, I'd charge them $30. And city house calls were even more numerous, however, 3 to 5 a day, mostly in the evening and nighttime, every day. Although a telephone answering service was employed, all doctors answered or returned all calls himself. One flu weekend from Friday night to Monday morning, I received 92 incoming telephone calls. Since mobile phones had not been invented yet, I always was happy to be in the car between destinations so I would not get called. However, I always had to find a phone as soon as I arrived in order to check to see what calls had come in. A doctor was never off duty. One time I broke my kneecap playing tennis with friends, and on going to the hospital was placed in a long leg cast extending from my groin all the way down to my ankle. I returned home and promptly fell in our small bathroom, the cast catching between the wall and the commode. Neither my wife nor I could get it untangled. She called an ambulance with a request from me, a specific request, please don't use the siren. We could hear the ambulance siren all the way from the hospital to our house, alerting the neighbors to all come stand outside to see what all the commotion was about. After extraction from the bathroom and being placed in the ambulance, the attendant turned out to be a father of one of my patients, and he kept a running conversation, medical questions concerning his daughter until we arrived at the emergency room. During the evaluation of my untangled leg, I received a call on the emergency room phone about a sick child, so I asked the parent to bring the child to the emergency room for me to see the child. She was very surprised when her doctor met her in a wheelchair with a leg extended straight into full cast and pale as a sheet. Her first remark was, "You look sicker than my daughter." As a pediatrician, it was difficult to determine the age group I wanted to see. I built the first adolescent waiting room with an outside door to accommodate those getting a little old for a baby doctor. But again, the upper age limit was harder to find. It did enable me to see people like the junior Miss America that came to town and became ill, or a young musician at the time, Joe Ely, or even a father and his son on the same checkup. One time I admitted a young lady to the hospital, and when I was unable to find her on the admittance sheet later, I learned she had registered under her married name. She feared that if she told me she was married, I might not follow up and see her. Dramatic and far-reaching changes continue to occur in pediatrics. On my arrival as a new doctor in Lubbock, I was privileged to be the first local doctor to perform a complete exchange blood transfusion on a newborn with RH disease. This is where the mother and the child have different blood types, and if the child has this and is sensitized, can jaundice and get so high it can cause brain damage or death. And I performed the first one of those. I was very proud of that. Within 10 years, however, this continued progress that we made in pediatrics made this procedure obsolete. When it was where it was almost impossible to save a premature infant under 2 1/4 pounds in the 1950s when I first arrived, and I had the youngest, the slightest one I had was a 1 3/4 pounds at birth that was saved, and I didn't do it. I'm sure the good Lord let the child be saved. But now 70 to 85% of children, anybody over 2 1/2 to 3 pounds, can be saved. Very precise machines and monitoring equipment had a major effect on saving older children also. Antibiotics continued to be released. Vaccines saved millions of lives. Diphtheria and its vaccine. Diphtheria was reduced from 176,000 cases in 1900 to 1 case in 1998. Measles, which caused a lot of deaths and so forth, went from 500,000 cases to 89 in 1998. And smallpox from 48,000 cases, terrible disease, from 48,000 cases to 0 in 1998. And tetanus from 1,300 to 34 cases in 1998. I have an idea that many of you have children saved only because of new knowledge and techniques in the last 50 years. Surgical techniques, even done with children inside the womb, save many now and helped raise the quality of life in many ways. Vaccines, medicines, physician education, all were involved. But sadly, I remember many children that these miracles did not arrive in time to help. My thoughts go back to a little boy named Jerry, who lingered for months with a malignant liver tumor before dying. Could he possibly have been helped with a liver transplant or chemotherapy? I remember Angel, a beautiful little blonde girl, born with an open spine and with paralysis from the waist down. We know now that 1 daily dose of a vitamin, riboflavin, given to the expectant mother possibly may have prevented this. And little Gregory, a 5-year-old beautiful child who developed paralytic polio from his neck down and spent the last 2 years of his life in an iron lung in the front room of his home, nursed completely by his mother and friends. Could he have been spared by a sugar cube with 3 drops of vaccine on it? Yet I think the best is yet to come. We always will have children with illness and imperfect bodies. They always will need help, given from their parents, the community, from the medical profession, and from the blessings of a higher being. 55 years. I have enjoyed being a doctor. I've enjoyed the progress of pediatric medicine. I've enjoyed becoming a part in the medical lives of my patients and their families. Good progress has been made on my watch. The future is indeed a bright new dawn waiting to unfold. There is a lot more and increasing knowledge on the way. Thank you. I guess before I'll sit down, does anybody have any questions about anything about that I might help as far as what happened in your life and anything? I don't know, maybe. Yes.
Well, I was in Fort Worth, Dallas, Fort Worth, I was born in 1941, and I remember the polio, obviously. My mother used to take me to Forest Park in Fort Worth and let me ride the merry-go-round, but she would pour alcohol over my hand when I got off. Did that help me from getting polio, or was that
Probably helped a little bit.
a little bit?
Yeah. One of the things that we found in this, I hear every once in a while now that it's about all the sterility that everybody talks about, on shopping carts and things like that, is that we found in the polio epidemic that we noticed that there were more people getting polio, children getting polio, from the better sections of town than there were in the low economic groups. And it was determined that they were exposed so early into the polio virus that many of them developed immunity because they had those exposures, whereas the people who were in the upper class of town tried to keep everything so sterile and clean.
My mother
and so
did,
forth.
yeah.
That they just were susceptible to developing polio when they got exposed, not like the other children. I thought that was sort of an interesting type thing. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a friend that, as a child, had polio, and now in the latter years, it's been probably the last 8, she started developing things, aches and so on, and no one could diagnose what it was until she finally found a doctor that had worked in that program, and it was post-polio syndrome. Is that a common thing now? That is.
Yes, it's not uncommon. It's called a phantom limb. It's like that your nerve is still there, and your nerve is getting signals in the distal part of that nerve that tells it the toe is hurting, but there's no toe there, and so forth. So that there is irritation on that nerve, and that's making you have those sensations. So yes, that one of the things that I've read several articles about that.
Because it's been very painful,
Yeah.
and it's been a number of years, and
Yeah.
finally she ran into
Yeah.
somebody that had worked with these cases.
Mhm. And that's the same way in the Civil War, where they amputated arms and legs and so forth quite a lot. They found that to be true, that the people would complain of their toe hurting or their finger hurting or their leg and their arm has gone to sleep. You know, things like that when there was nothing there to have any of those things occur. But it's because the nerve was irritated in that particular sensory nerve. Yes?
What did they determine to be the way that the virus was spread with polio? Was it just laying dormant, or was it something that they were?
It's like anything else, like with flu, for example. You know, it spread from person to person. I think the fact that we kept down big crowds, close to swimming pools, things like that helped tremendously, because it usually was through the intestinal tract as much as anything else, either through the saliva, getting on your hands and so forth, shaking hands with you, getting in large groups and so forth, like catching a cold from somebody. Same thing, it's a virus type thing.
Well, I know my mom said that her dad wouldn't let her go to camp.
Mhm.
That he made her drink milk all the time.
Yeah.
He'd make her drink, 8 glasses of milk a day, and that he wouldn't let her go swim in the summer with anybody, things like that. when she
Absolutely.
was-
And I think that obviously helps some of the things, like drinking milk was good for you anyway, but keep your resistance up. But as far as it being something specifically for polio, probably didn't help that much, but it's good to have done. We tried everything. They would come to us from Dallas, the health department, and say, what do you think we ought to do? Well, we'd close summer schools, we'd close the swimming pools, we'd tell people not to have family gatherings, things like that. All of these things help cut down the contagiousness, the spreading of it, but it still was there.
Was it only in the summer in the heat?
Primarily, yes. Yeah. And I think that's because, again, groups were getting together, had something to do with all the groups getting together in the summertime, the swimming pools and so forth. I think that had something to do with it.
Speaking as the son of Dr. Carr, to have a father who's a pediatrician is a kind of a different experience, because when you're sitting there at the breakfast table and you're trying to think about whether or not you might want to con your way out of not going to school, you learn to take real careful note about, Dad, my stomach's upset, because in this case, he just might do something about it. So consequently, in my office today, I have framed the 4 perfect attendance records from elementary school. I did not miss a day of school until 5th grade. I think largely because I just didn't want to be sick. It was because he would come in and say, well, let's see, that pharmaceutical salesman, he's dropped this off. Let's see his. So it's a little bit different experience. And even today, in my work as a psychologist, I know that there's a sort of a calming voice that I think that he has with expectant mothers, because the definition of a first-time parent is, if you're a first-time parent, if the temperature hits 99, you call the pediatrician at 3 o'clock in the morning. A multiple-time parent, unless the bone's sticking out, it's like, well, if it's not better by Monday, we'll go see the doctor.
This is my son Brian, by the way, and 2 daughters over there, Valerie and Julie. So, yeah, Paige.
As a patient of yours, from the time I was little bitty, and then my daughter, who will be 17 in April, and when I had my daughter, I went to a pediatrician who will remain nameless, was not you. And when she was 2 weeks old, I got in a row with the nurse, and she told me I was blowing things out of proportion. And I said, have you ever had kids? And she said, no, I don't have children. And I said, then I don't even want to talk to you. And I called Charlotte that worked for you, and I'd gone to high school with her. And my daughter then went to you, and you were her doctor till you retired.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask your opinion on the HPV vaccine.
Yes, I think it's a good thing. Certainly, you know, one might say, well, it's going to be 10, 15 years before we know how long it's going to last or if there's any side effects that we're not aware of now. But that's true with anything that's new.
Mhm.
And I think with the studies they've done so far, it appears to be it's a good thing. Now, on a political basis, I'm not real sure that I agree with what was done that way. But I think as far as the vaccine itself, it's a good thing to get, and probably will turn out to be an excellent thing for young girls to get. Anything else?
Thank you again.
All right, I enjoyed it.
Yes.